Wer rettet die Welt? Der Ö1 Festival Podcast zur Klima Biennale Wien.
What we see here on the walls is the so-called sea of flags from the activist group Artists for Future. These are over 50 flags, which are also used at many demonstrations. They're emblazoned with slogans and messages that address issues such as the climate crisis and climate justice.
That was Dorothea Trappel, the initiator of the Activism Camp, a cooperation project between the Vienna Klima Biennale and the Wiener Festwochen. The Volkskundemuseum for the next month, also called the House of the Republic, will be the venue for numerous workshops and a meeting place until the end of June. Various forms of activism will be presented and discussed in the rooms on the ground floor of the building.
My vision would be for the scene to network better with each other, that there are spaces here where they like to spend time, where a bridge is built to a middle-class audience that loses the fear of coming into contact with activists. Because the normal citizen, the inhibition threshold is simply insanely high to find access to activism. And there are hardly any occupations anymore if you're not already an activist to begin with. Here, you simply have the opportunity to come in and spend time here and see if you can strike up a conversation.
More than 20 national and international activist groups are part of the Activism Camp. Over 50 programme items will be presented over the course of 5 weeks. A platform for exchange for everyone and especially for the organisations themselves. The Austrian Youth Council is also taking part.
For me, the Activism Camp means hope, a ray of hope at a time when we are experiencing a global shift to the right and tipping points worldwide.
Says Simona, an A-level student and member of the Austrian Youth Council, the so-called Jugendrat.
Activism is where the movement is born, and I think it's very much underestimated what positive effects activism has had on our everyday social life.
For Simona, a radical optimism is the only way to defend herself against existing injustices. She sees activism as a kind of basic attitude that has accompanied her since early childhood.
I think activism is actually the approach through which I understand the world. I can't actually remember a time when I wasn't an activist. So my first contact with activism was when I was 6 and the Hundelwald, which is in my neighbourhood, was to be demolished and a rally was organised and I shouted through a megaphone, "No concrete in the Hundelwald." That was my first experience with activism.
The Hundelwald, a local recreation area in the Viennese district of Hietzing, was the focus of discussions about the construction of a rehabilitation centre for years. Political parties, citizens' initiatives and neighbours finally successfully fought against the planned construction project. The St. Marx für alle initiative is campaigning for the preservation of another area in the centre of Vienna.
This is a
44,000 square metre space in the 3rd district. And at this location, which is very untypical for Vienna, there are several self-organised initiatives with an association structure that are located there as interim uses with precarious contracts. And so I would say that social exclusion mechanisms are particularly strong and particularly evident in such marginal locations. And it's my personal approach to dealing with this.
Says Flores. The aforementioned site in St. Marx belongs to Wien Holding. The construction of a multi-purpose hall has been planned here for years, with devastating potential consequences for the climate and neighbouring residents. Together with his colleague Ida, Flores represents the St. Marx für alle initiative, which opposes the mega-project.
Diese Fläche, würde ich auch sagen, schreit eigentlich nach Aktivismus, weil
I would also say that this area actually cries out for activism because the city of Vienna has completely different plans for this area. And as Florian has already mentioned, a lot of injustice is crystallizing here, also in terms of participation in urban development. And with the idea of a climate-friendly city, precisely such areas would be potential places where climate justice can also take place and can be planned or not planned, but can be self-managed, can happen and simply remain undeveloped. Because that's what the city needs. The city needs breathing soils and spaces. The city must somehow be able to stabilize its climate. And green roofs alone will not lead us out of the climate crisis.
All events of the activism camp are open to interested parties. The St. Mark's initiative will also be offering a discussion event as part of the programme, which will focus on the topic of belonging.
One major experience is that many people simply no longer feel that they belong in the city and have no political say. And that starts with such small things as the property management, which does everything without asking you first. In the urban context, the dispossession of urban space has progressed very far, and many people are struggling with the fact that they no longer feel they belong in the city. And what we can offer is also a perspective of self-organisation and community that is formed in this urban space. And as a part of the Klima Biennale, we will also be inviting people to spend a good time with us in the space in St. Mark's, where activists, politically interested people and neighbours will come together.
Aktivistinnen, politisch Interessierte und auch Nachbarinnen aufeinander.
The members of the initiatives and organisations agree that there is still room for improvement when it comes to climate policy, even if the issues they represent and their approach to activism can be very different. Max is a campaigner for the international movement ATTAC, which campaigns for a democratic, socio-ecological and gender-equitable organisation of the global economy. For him, the activism camp is an opportunity not only to look at the differences between the activist groups, but also to find a common denominator.
It really depends. We share a lot of goals, but how do we communicate them so that we talk about them? Especially this year, with the elections coming up. We're in so many political discussions, and that perhaps also plays into the question of how can I be an activist? I think this year it's very important to have as many political conversations as possible, and not just talk about what the right-wingers are doing or what they're discussing, but to set our topics, whether it's education, whether it's climate, whether it's health, whether it's feminist struggles. I think we have to be on the ball when it comes to care, nursing, etc. And in the various workshops, I think there is a lot of useful information to exchange about what works, what doesn't work, and to simply take a bit of time to discuss it.
ATTAC will also be organising an entire day of workshops as part of the Climate Biennale to initiate discussions.
On the topic, how can we plan a democratic economy? How can we socialise energy companies so that they act and operate in an ecologically and socially just way? Then we'll also be talking a lot about feminist socialisation. And on the other day, we want to organise a workshop on wealth distribution, the widening gap between the rich and the poor. What can be done about it? The core topics of redistribution, climate justice, fair energy policy, simply to contribute here and network and exchange ideas.
Einfach hier einbringen und uns dazu vernetzen, auszutauschen.
The use of social networks and media reception of these is part of the workshop that Simona from the Youth Council will lead, together with another colleague.
Where we deal with the topic of the climate crisis and scrolling in a playful way.
Doom scrolling describes the uncontrolled consumption of negative news and information on social media. Simona also struggles with this widespread habit. For her, activism is a way of escaping the maelstrom of the digital world.
What I realise about activism is that it's something that gets me out and about. It's something that lets me get to know Vienna because I simply get around so much. What would be the alternative? The alternative would be for me to sit at home and scroll through social media. And it's something that a lot of people of my generation just struggle with this powerlessness that you feel when you're doom scrolling. But at the same time, you keep at it and keep going. And this doom scrolling is exploited by right-wing parties, in particular right-wing extremists. If you look at people like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro from America, they have an incredible platform. And basically our idea in the workshops is to look at what's happening in the real world and from what critical perspective can you judge and contextualize these media makers from the far right.
The Youth Council workshop is explicitly aimed at young people between the ages of 12 and 14. Activists agree that the topic of activism has a label that is often misunderstood.
I think activism actually arises quite quickly when you look at all the strategic plans in Europe, and now in Austria in particular, and see that everything is simply not included, which priorities are set.
Says Ida from St. Marx für alle.
And the framework in which you can get involved as part of the population. You can see how the cogs are tightly wound within the bureaucracy, and I automatically end up in an activist environment because everything simply works too little and too slowly within this state framework. And that's why we have to organize ourselves differently and take up the issues from below and combine our struggles together.
The term activism can have a strange connotation and is not always seen in a positive light. Yet many of the achievements of modern societies are based on activist movements, explains Simona from the Youth Council. Ida from St. Marx für alle adds,
you don't have to be afraid of activism, and everyone should be able to do activism and have the confidence to do it. And if you start talking to us, if the topic interests you and if it's important for the person in question to contribute to the justice movement, then you're automatically involved in activism. And then you can decide how extremely you want to take it. But activism is not the same as civil disobedience. It can happen on different levels. And I think that a lot of people are activists who don't see themselves as activists. Not yet. But perhaps we're opening up this field to many groups and people.
With her work for St. Marx für alle, Ida wants to open up the activist field to people and groups who want to get more actively involved in socially relevant issues. Simona from the Youth Council adds,
a very brief addition to this. These are people who are activists, even though they don't see themselves as such. I have the impression that this is particularly the case with feminism, because, for example, when I talk to my mum or my grandma, I get all my feminist views from them, but only after many conversations do they start to describe themselves as feminist. So that's so true, that sentence, and I think that's really important to mention here. And that's where I think the Climate Biennale, or the activism camp specifically, is a good place to realise that activism and feminism are not labels that are off-putting, that are scary, that don't achieve anything, but actually offer a community in which there is strength.
You've been listening to
Wer rettet die Welt?
Created by Till Köppel and spoken by Julie McCarthy, Rosie Waits, Tom Midler and Chris Cummins.